I want to start with the gas sector. Coal seam gas, clean and green or something else? The green credentials of the coal seam gas industry, well, are in question, according to reports of new research from Southern Cross University. You might have caught this report from Peter McCutcheon on ABC TV's 7:30 program last night. Just have a listen.
CSG is a major employer and is creating more than 18,000 jobs in Queensland alone.
Coal seam gas is booming across southern Queensland and is now expanding into New South Wales. The industry is pushing its economic benefits as well as its green credentials.
Natural coal seam gas. It's cleaner, it's safer, it's jobs, it is the future.
When we compare it against the other options, primarily coal, it's up to 70% less greenhouse gas emissions.
But there's one critical element in this equation that we know very little about. How many greenhouse gas emissions leak into the atmosphere during the extraction process, what the industry calls fugitive emissions?
Fugitive emissions are emissions that escape from the intended process of production. So they're emissions that escape maybe through pipelines or from wellheads or through the soil that aren't an intended part of the process of generating the natural gas.
So, in an attempt to measure these elusive emissions, researchers from the Southern Cross University took part of their laboratory into the field around northern New South Wales and the Tara gas fields in southern Queensland.
This is new technology, so our specific approach of driving a car and taking readings on the go is new.
This method allowed them to take many more samples than was previously available. As expected, their spectrometer recorded low atmospheric levels of methane outside the gas fields. But once they got near the gas wells, the picture changed quite dramatically.
They're extremely high. They're some of the highest ever found anywhere. Those concentrations are higher than found in Siberia, in some of the largest gas fields from Russia.
It could be a one-off. That's the problem with doing one study. We don't know. What we now need to do is to check, firstly, the same field as it evolves through its stages of production, and secondly, to see whether this is happening elsewhere.
Carbon cycle scientist Professor Peter Raine has studied the Southern Cross University data and agrees it raises some significant questions. He says the data suggests the methane came from under the ground, which could have serious consequences.
The problem is that methane is a much more serious greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So every little bit of methane that you leak as you try and mine this stuff, process it or burn it, contributes much more than the carbon dioxide.
And that's bad news for any industry operating under a carbon tax. But the industry's peak body, the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, says this is all highly speculative.
I think the study is incomplete. I think there's much more work that needs to be done before they can reach conclusions. Do I think that this would fundamentally change the industry? No. These are, as you said, very small amounts that we're working with here, and even within the range that are being talked about, it would not fundamentally change the equation that says gas is better for the environment than coal.
I think the take-out message is that we gotta make sure we take samples before we change the way the environment is working. We found very high concentrations, and we are now in a position, what the hell that means?
Should have this been done 10 years ago?
Oh, I think 10, 15, the issue is now, should we support ongoing development and research? Yes, we should, and that's what our position is.
So lots of information to try to consume there. And finishing that report was Rick Wilkinson from the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association. Also in there was Isaac Santos, who is one of the researchers from Southern Cross University. So a couple of key points. Those researchers monitored methane levels in the air and water around gas fields in Tara, in southern parts of Queensland. They found that those levels were much higher than those found in the Richmond Valley on the New South Wales north coast. So they compared the two, and that's an area where there's no CSG extraction taking place at this stage. But I guess the big question here is, can CSG production be blamed for the difference in methane levels? And the researchers themselves, they say that, well, they can't conclude that. They need more information on that front. And they have suggested that how they did this study could be a good way of getting baseline data now and into the future. 4 on ABC Local Radio Queensland. And let's bring into the discussion Professor Stephen Raine, who is one of 7 gas fields commissioners in Queensland. He's also from the University of Southern Queensland. Stephen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Craig. How are you?
Not too bad, thanks. A lot to get through as far as this research is concerned. Have you had a chance to review it yourself?
Yes, look, I have had a chance to have a look at it. I mean, this is very much a preliminary study, and there's no formal report that's been produced yet by the researchers. They're obviously still looking at doing some additional analysis before they do publish formally, but I have had a chance to see some of their data, and particularly the spatial data, as it relates to the Surat Basin area.
Okay, so how much weight do you give this research, given that we're not into that final report stage? Or we haven't actually seen published results as such, peer-reviewed?
Yeah, look, obviously any data is good data. It's great to get some data that allows us to start to evaluate what's occurring in the area. It is very much a preliminary study, so let's be honest and say these guys have taken an instrument, they've strapped it to a vehicle, and they've driven all the way from New South Wales up through a few different areas, and they've driven around the roads through Tara and up to Condamine and then across to sort of heading towards Dalby and then back down again. And they've taken readings all the way along, and I guess there's questions around that it's a single point in time study, so we really don't have any understanding about what this is in terms of background. And I note in their study they also talk about things like they've actually stopped at places next to landfills and next to bushfires and other things, and there's no real correlation at the moment to indicate where those things occurred that might have influenced some of these data. So I guess, it's a little bit difficult to try and draw a coherent story out of what might be causing some of these variations that we're seeing in the data.
But that said, the data is demonstrating, and this might be the concerning element, that there are elevated methane levels in areas where CSG wells are present.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at some of the maps now, Craig, and part of the challenge here is there are elevated areas in the data that are well outside of where the gas fields are. There are some elevated readings within the gas fields, no doubt about that. But there's also a large number of readings within the gas fields that are no different to the background readings well outside of the areas of development. So it's a little bit of a confused story. There's a few variations in there, and it's difficult to get your head around exactly why those variations might be there at the moment. If we think about the whole region, I think one of the claims that's made, and I'm not sure how sustained it is because I haven't been able to look at all of the data, but one of the claims is that this whole region is much higher than in other areas. It's not clear whether that's a function of the industry or whether, in fact, that's just a function of the geology in the area, given that we've got a lot of coal seam beds that are actually close to the surface and naturally emit stray emissions into the atmosphere. So it could be that. It could be a function of the intensity of development in the area from other industries as well. You mentioned... It's not really clear.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt there, Peter, but you mentioned stray emissions, Stephen, pardon me, and if we just follow that for a second, in the report we just heard from Peter McCutcheon, he described them as fugitive emissions. How are they actually defined?
Yeah, look, there's a slight difference here, and this is a bit of terminology that obviously originated in the US. Fugitive emissions are normally regarded as those emissions that come from some sort of industry development, and I think you heard that explained in the previous article. But there are natural emissions that occur from coal beds as well. And where they're not actually part of industry, as in they're just naturally occurring in the landscape, probably the better word to use for them would be stray emissions. And that's a word that's commonly used in the US for those sort of emissions.
So really to determine whether they are naturally occurring or as a result or increased levels because of CSG production, there needs to be some form of baseline data then, doesn't there?
Oh, look, absolutely. And I guess that's a little bit of a concern in relation to this study. This is just a single point in time study, so it's a bit hard to sort of put it in a context of whether there's been any increase in emissions as a function of the industry. And I guess that's a little bit of an indictment on the industry as well over the years, that there's not a lot of baseline information out there publicly. And I guess I'd be really interested in seeing more research looking at what happens over a period of time and using methodologies which allow us to track what's happening at particular locations. So this particular methodology is obviously giving us a quick snapshot over a large area, but if there were hotspots or areas of concern, then I think we'd certainly be looking at research that would track those changes over time in great detail.
It's just after 4:15 on ABC Local Radio Queensland, and with you is Professor Stephen Raine, who is one of Queensland's Gasfields Commissioners, has been looking through this research from Southern Cross University. You mentioned baseline data and a real lack of it. Doesn't this then demonstrate that these sorts of studies should be done before gas exploration and production is even allowed?
Look, my view is certainly that should be the case, but that's not really an issue in terms of so long as you can track the changes over time. If there are going to be impacts, then you'll identify those reasonably quickly. For any new development, there's no great drama in going out and getting some background measurements. These are not, difficult to obtain. But previously we haven't gone out and taken those measurements, and I think that's something that we should be looking to rectify as we go forward. Yeah,
because there's no monitoring regime to that effect currently in Queensland, is there?
Well, the companies themselves actually are required to do quite a bit of detailed testing around particular wellheads and sources of emission. But I guess my concern at the moment would be that we haven't seen a lot of that data out in the public domain, and I think that would be a useful thing. And I think we haven't seen that data tracked over time as well. And as I said, the companies for particular point sources take that information. But once you get away from the gas fields themselves and the wellhead, and you get into some of the areas where they might expand into the future, obviously we don't have those measurements in those areas.
Yeah, so is that something being discussed by the Gasfields Commission, that data needs to be sought, whether it's done by the government, companies or landholders themselves?
Yeah, look, absolutely. One of the things that I'm keen to do in my portfolio of science and research is obviously get a handle on not only what information is being collected, but what research is being done. We're certainly looking into that. In terms of regulation and enforcement, this is stuff that's normally done through the government departments. But our role is really to try and facilitate making sure that we've got good information and good science out in the public domain.
But does that mean that the Gasfields Commission is of the opinion that there needs to be regulation to make sure that there is baseline data before production or exploration begins?
No, look, I don't see that there's a need for regulation, but I do see that there needs to be some data obtained prior to expanding into areas, and that's really just good practice as part of undertaking longer-term studies. And I don't see a particular need for regulation out of any of this data. As I said, this data raises more questions around some of the stray emissions than probably what it does around the industry itself, I would suspect.
Yeah, but if it's not made into regulation, then there's no standard that needs to be adopted right across the Surat Basin. That if there's no regulation, then not every company has to follow the same sort of testing regime then.
Yeah, look, I think you might be jumping ahead of the cart here a little bit. I mean, I don't see that on the basis of the data we've got in front of us here, yep. Which is reporting very, very low levels of methane, that this is something that we would be particularly perturbed about at the moment. Until we better understand the data and better understand what it's telling us in relation to the sources of those emissions, and I think we're just getting well ahead of the game here, Craig.
Professor Stephen Raine, really do appreciate your time. Thanks for looking through that research for us.
No problems at all, Craig. Good luck, mate. Cheers, bye.
Professor Stephen Raine, who is one of the 7 Gasfields Commissioners in Queensland, and he's in charge of sort of the science and research portfolio as part of that organisation. At 4:20.